So the title of this study is Investigating the Vocational Rehabilitation Service Experience of African American Women Living with HIV/AIDS. So I want to give a little bit of background information on why we decided to do this study. So we know that the Rehabilitation Services Administration recently released the latest data set. So some of the older articles you'll see look at the data set from 2007, 8, and 9. So now we can kind of look at 9, 10, 11, some more recent data trends to see if what's going on is different. Are we improving things? Or things such as quality of employment rates increasing? Or are they remaining the same? So this is one of the things that we are kind of looking at. And I'll talk about our results and a little bit of the context from the earlier sessions as well. So we'll talk about the new changes and data trends. So right now, we always know that African Americans and Latinos or any minority groups experience the poorest health outcomes in terms of health, vocational services, et cetera. So those things are like common knowledge, but yet, even though they're common knowledge, these disparities still exist year after year, decade after decade. So something's going on with like the intervention services that we're providing. With African American women living with HIV, actually things are getting better. Over the past 10-year time frame, it seems as though new diagnoses are kind of decreasing, and for women in general, their health is getting better. But even though their health is getting better, there's still a disparity in outcomes between African American women. So women as a whole, they're getting better. Black women are getting better, but they're getting better slower than whites and Latinos. So with the new HIV medications, highly active antiretroviral medication, we know that you can achieve viral suppression. So that just means that in your body you have less than, say, 5 copies of the HIV virus. So that's basically like, I don't have it, but you can't say we have a cure because without the medication, you don't have that viral suppression. So people can live healthy lives with the virus. It's more of a chronic illness, and people who are living healthy lives, they say that I have either viral suppression or I have an undetectable viral load. Those are the two things you'll hear people say. So yes, I have HIV, but I have achieved viral suppression, or yes, I have HIV and I have an undetectable viral load. So that's as healthy as you can get with living with the virus. So in terms of health, that's what's going on. But also in living with HIV, you have to think about, okay, on the one hand, I'm getting better with the HIV. But because of things such as drug toxicity or being cognizant of taking care of the HIV, but not being cognizant of taking care of other health conditions that you may have or that you may be disposed to, would be things like diabetes, hypertension. So they may have control over the HIV, but they may not have control over other chronic conditions. And then the drugs that treat the HIV come with a lot of side effects that lead to health detriments. So when we're thinking about vocational rehab services, people may say, well, do they qualify for having a disability because HIV is getting better? Well, yeah, they have the HIV. You can think about HIV as the secondary condition, and maybe not primary. And then you think about the impact of diabetes, hypertension, or any other chronic illness, what we would call HIV multimorbidity or HIV comorbidity. So this gives them the qualification to still have VR services because that makes them disabled. We also look at the mental health outcomes. So if you have HIV, which may be controlled, you may have an undetectable viral load, but you have HIV, diabetes, hypertension, and then depression because you have a stigmatized illness and you're worried about how the community feels about you, then that's 4 conditions. And if we know with VR, 4 conditions is probably going to put you at a category 1 for receiving services. So this is why you have to have the dual argument. Yes, HIV care is improving and we're getting better, but as we get better with one, something else happens. So that's what the statistics just kind of shows you, those trends. So with WIOA, the focus has been on transition age youth, so that you hear that a lot. What are we going to do for transition age youth? And when you look at youth, actually they're the ones that are growing, the kind of 16 to 25 age group, and even as low as 13 in some trends, they're really being negatively impacted by HIV because of risky sex behaviors. But then when we look at African Americans, it's mostly the African American males and men who speak men that have the poorest outcomes, as you can see from the first chart. If you look at African American women, once again, they're not as poorly impacted as Black males, Latino males, white males, but still, if you look at women, they're 777 having HIV, but then 218 white females and 203 Latino females. And what's also interesting when you're looking at the disparity is, okay, African Americans represent 12 to 13% of the population, right? Hispanic Americans, we can say 14 to 15%. Why are their numbers so closely associated with whites? So that means that their health is comparable to whites, but we're both minorities and we're both minority groups that have similar diversity in America. Hispanics are the largest minority. We're the second largest minority. When you look at Hispanic health outcomes, they're more similar to white health outcomes. When you look at health outcomes for African Americans, there's a difference. So we're both minority groups, so people say minority health is different, but then there's disparities within minority health. So that's something I really wanted to point out. Like if you just look at those numbers, white females 218, Hispanic females 203. So their health is kind of comparable. So there's things coming out. I think maybe 2 months ago is when President Obama signed the National HIV/AIDS Strategy for the United States. So the last strategy went from 2010 to 2015, and this strategy goes from 2015 to 2020. Hi, we got another participant. Thanks for coming in. And so the vision, it looks a little small, but it says the United States will become a place where new HIV infections are rare when they no longer occur. Every person, regardless of age, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic circumstance, will have unfettered access to high quality, life-extending care free from stigma and discrimination. So stigma and discrimination are tied to health now. So one of the interesting things too, if you look at Healthy 2020, now we know that poverty, homelessness, low socioeconomic status, these are social determinants of health. Before, they wouldn't necessarily look at those risk factors as salient as they would say race and ethnicity, geographic region, but now we know that for sure poverty combined with homelessness, combined with stigma, all of those things are social determinants of health for persons living with HIV. One of the things that will be an essential component for us as vocational rehab professionals will be number 3, which would be reduce HIV-related health disparities and health inequities. And we know that poverty, low income, all of those things that are associated with unemployment lead to poor health outcomes. So these are, now the White House is starting to look at, okay, now we have to have things like vocational services, housing services. We have to do more than just link them to HIV meds. We have to do more than this condom distribution and reducing risky sex behaviors. Now we have to look at their housing situation. We have to look at whether they're employed, whether they're on SSI or SSDI, or those kind of things. In this new strategy, it's kind of more holistic for outcomes. So, go ahead.
Okay, so
sure.
can you hear me? Does that work? Okay. So we actually found 2 really great videos to talk a little bit about this national initiative, and based on what Dr. Johnson-Milligan had just repeated, that it's nice that we have a different focus, and it's not so much on the micro level, it's more of a macro level, so more of a national initiative, and it's a global initiative. And so thinking about being socially active practitioners of change is, this initiative versus just individual care on a daily basis, medications, but more of a holistic perspective. And so that's very important for the rehabilitation counseling. So the 2 videos that we have. The first one is the acting director, Dr. Amy Lansky. And she has a passion for working for ending HIV. So she's very much connected with this national initiative and focusing on the bigger picture. So I'm gonna show you that video, and you can get a little bit of an idea of the direction that we're headed, which is very positive, actually. Okay, so is that good?
Go ahead.
Okay.
We're just going to do a volume check for the audience.
Okay.
Just 1 second.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is it over there? Oh, maybe. Shoot. Do you know? Maybe one of the buttons on.
Okay. So we don't want to take too much time. Maybe towards the end of the presentation, if we have time to work with the video audio and the audience doesn't mind waiting a little bit, we'll try to make sure that we can show the clips.
So the first video was, again, about the national perspective and the acting director with the national, And the second video, hopefully we'll get a chance to show that to you guys later. The second video really focused on work and actually interviewed several different individuals with HIV that have used work as a recovery tool. So it's interesting, hopefully we can get to show it, but it really looked at the perspective of a daily application, how work can be a recovery tool, that it is part of this fundamental holistic approach that we need to consider when assisting individuals with HIV. So for the purpose of this study, after we were collecting the data, we became with two research questions. Thank you. So the first research question, for the years 2010 to 2013, is there a statistically significant difference in the eligibility acceptance rate of African American women diagnosed with HIV compared to the rest of the population of persons with disabilities serviced by the state federal vocational rehabilitation system? And the second question, for the years 2010 to 2013, what factors, age, education level, receipt of cash benefits, and vocational rehabilitation services received influence competitive employment status for African American women diagnosed with HIV serviced in the state federal vocational rehabilitation system?
Thank you. So this technology is awesome, but you have to do a lot of back and forth. So we'll look at the methodology. So early on, if you sat in Dr. Chan's presentation with Dr. Strasser, they talked about using the Rehabilitation Services Administration's data set, which is called the RSA 911 data set, as a tool in order to extract data about how well state federal vocational rehabilitation services are doing. Do we really get a return on the investment for every dollar that we provide services? Are they getting back to work? Are they paying taxes? And so we can use the RSA database as a tool in order to see how effective that service delivery process is. And I'm sorry I misquoted the years that we use. We use 2010 to 2013 instead of 2009 to 2012, as I said earlier. So this was an ex post facto study. So we know with the Rehab Services Administration, our vocational rehabilitation counselors, they kind of document all services that they provide to persons with disabilities from application phase all the way until they're out of the system, no matter how they get out of the system. And employed, not employed, did they drop out before services, did they drop out after services? Those are the things that are kind of covered. So in 1995, they provided a coding manual. And so from that coding manual, you kind of understand how you're going to use the data. So from one, you may say the first service that a person could get, which is assessment, that is coded as 1. So that means when you're doing math, you know, every time you see that 1, it means assessment. So that's just a basic generality that comes with the service manual. So looking at the persons with disabilities that were served from 2010 to 2013, we see that they had 2,371,024 clients whose cases were closed from 2010 to 2013. And this is just closed. It doesn't matter how they were closed. So as this focus for our study was on African Americans, we're kind of going to say, let's extract this African American population, let's extract this African American women population, let's extract this African American women population of persons with HIV. So we have this small kind of data set, and we want to look at it in comparison to the larger one. So we want to see, is there a disparity in outcomes based on being a part of this really tight group, this tight homogeneous group of being African American female person with HIV in comparison to all other disabilities serviced by the Rehabilitation Services Administration during that time frame. So for that little small group, we have 743 women with HIV that applied for services and matriculated through the process. So we have two dependent variables in this study. The first dependent variable would be eligibility and acceptance rate. So there are a couple things that can happen to you when you come in for VR services. You can stop services as an applicant. You can kind of stop services after they've done kind of a trial work experience, or they say, you know what, we can't really determine whether or not employment will be suitable for you, so let's put you out there and see if you can try it out, or let's do some extended evaluations with you. Let's send you to a voc evaluator to see if you can do some kind of simulated work sample test. That kind of stuff happens. Some people may exit out of that. Some people exit with an employment outcome. That's the gold standard. Everyone wants to see those 26 closure statuses. Some people exit without an employment outcome after they receive services. That's what we kind of don't want to see, because we've invested so much time and effort with the person with a disability. They've gotten services, but they still aren't employed. Some people exit without an employment outcome after signing an IPE, but before receiving services. So you've done all of the assessment, extended evaluation, you have their work goal in place, and you're ready to go to provide them services, but then they're out. Some people exited after order of a selection process. So if you are in a state that has those budget cuts and you have to be waitlisted, some people just get tired of waiting, or they say, you know, I have the self-efficacy and initiative, I'm going to go try to find a job on my own. And unfortunately, we can't track that data, because it could be some people that are actually finding employment just because they had the motivation to come to the agency to ask for it, and they got waitlisted, but they still went on. And then they can exit without an employment outcome after eligibility, but before an IPE. So we had to kind of recode that, because that's a lot of different ways to look at the dependent variable. So the first way we recoded it as the red one, so that would be 1, 2, and 6, were recoded as application accepted, application not accepted, or they're ineligible for services. So that means they're exited as an applicant, they exited after their trial work experience. So trial work experience is before we know whether or not they can even work, and then they're exited from order of selection. And then green is coded as they were actually accepted for services, but something happened along the process. Positive outcome employment, or they got dropped off along the process. So this kind of chart, I thought it was a cool way, and I was like, oh, when I found it, I'm going to use it with my students. That kind of breaks you through all of the RSA status codes and how you go from 0 to applicant to hopefully 26 closure, positive employment closure. And so then the second dependent variable will be the competitive employment status. So sometimes we look at employment as work versus not work, but we want to know if they're working, are they actually making a good salary, do they have good benefits? So that kind of stuff is employment too. So we want to know competitive employment and competitive quality employment. So competitive employment is defined as working full-time or part-time in an integrated setting, or whether or not you're in self-employment or you're a part of some type of business enterprise program. So a lot of states have a variety of business enterprise programs. There's specific ones that work really well. Vendor services for persons who are blind, that could be at some state buildings. So those are the kind of vendor programs we know about. And then non-competitive employment. So that he's not employed in an integrated setting after receiving VR services and completing the program. So our independent variable. So remember, our dependent variable would be that acceptance rate, eligibility rate, whether you're eligible for services or not. So we wanted to know if there's an impact on race, gender, disability, and HIV on your acceptance and eligibility rate. So this is where my interest in intersectionality kind of comes in. So you're looking at these multiple demographic factors and how they interact to influence an outcome. So those multiple intersectional factors, how do they affect your acceptance and eligibility rate for receiving VR services? And then related to DV2, when we want to look at competitive employment, then we're going to look at the whole vocational service continuum that rehab counselors can actually provide and see which one of those kind of impact. And then we have those particular predictors that we know from the research evidence that are oversighted, that they become common knowledge, that stuff like age, education, receipt of cash benefits, that they have an impact on employment. So this is what we know as common knowledge, so we use those predictors as well. And so I already talked about the impact of vocational rehab services on competitive employment. Okay, so this is just taking, when you, we call it eyeballing the data. So this is before we do chi-square, this is before we do logistic regression. We can kind of look at some of these patterns. So we broke the age groups up 16 to 34, 35 to 54, and 55 to 64. So kind of at the beginning of your work history, going towards the middle, transition age will be kind of 16 to 25-ish. So they're in there, and then that early work history as a young adult. And then your middle work history, that's where people say that you have the most dedicated employees, between the ages of 35 and 54, and 55 to 64, you can kind of see them at the end of their work life. So we know from this data that the top 3 services that all groups receive, all African American women with HIV, are assessment, vocational rehabilitation, counseling and guidance, and transportation services. So assessment, when does that typically kind of happen in the process? That's like right after application, right before IPE. So if you think about it contextually, of course assessment is going to come. So if they apply for services, they're going to get assessment. Vocational rehab and counseling and guidance, I mean, that's your work role. So of course that service is going to be provided. Like that seems to be kind of common sense as well, right? And then the other thing would be transportation services. So the transportation services is right when we're getting to kind of intervention. Like this is something that we're really doing outside of our normal realm of services. So we know we're going to assess you if we don't have any documentation to say you qualify for benefits or you qualify for services based on your disability. We know you're going to provide you some counseling and guidance if we accept you, because everyone gets that. So the first kind of service that they're getting that's strong as an intervention outside of that is transportation. But then let's look at the rest of the data. So we can take out reader services, interpreter services, personal assistance services, and technical assistance services. And it makes sense to take that out because it's not sensory disability that we're looking at. It's not ID or autism spectrum disorder or any of those, deafblind, physical disabilities. Those things are not really included in our population. They're not even listed as secondary disabilities strong enough to have a significant difference. So then let's look at some of the other things. So we have diagnosis and treatment of impairments. That's kind of pretty strong. It's not the number 1, but that's going on. If we look at things such as college and university training, occupational vocational training, on-the-job training, things start going down a little bit. So we're wondering, like, these are the key services that we know from the literature are really impacting, but then why are they so low? So that's just eyeballing the data before you even get to like consulting Chan and say, okay, let's run some regression. That's just, your common sense. So I kind of already walked you through what those services are that VR counselors provide. So for the first research question, which we're looking at acceptance eligibility rate, that's categorical data. Either you're accepted or not. So use chi-square to see if there's a difference based on just chance or there's a difference because of what's going on, right? So that's all of the p-values and all of that other stuff that I'm sure you guys don't want to hear about, but feel free to ask questions if you like. But basically that's why we use chi-square. And then for the data analysis for number 2, we want to look at those predictor variables to see which one really influences our outcome. And so regression analysis helps us to do that. And logistic regression is good for categorical data as opposed to some of the quantitative data that you will use other regression methods for. So for this study, we kind of use purposeful selection, and we talked about that a little bit previously. It's like the literature tells us that certain variables we know impact employment. We know it's age, education, receipt of Social Security benefits. So if we know this, we can use a purposeful sampling method to pull that from the data. And then there's statistical procedures in place by Hosmer and colleagues that say that this is a good process to use if you're going to do logistic regression. And they tell you a method in which to do it. So you're going to see, for those statistical persons in the room, where you may see some p-values that are a little higher if you decide to use a predictor variable, but they suggest that if you have a variable of 0.20 or 0.25 or below, it's a little less stringent than some of the other statistical models if you're using purposeful sampling. So if you have a predictor that shows up, as long as it's underneath that p-value, then it's still okay to use. Which is something I learned that was different. We always learn something like, yeah, we always want that P0001, right? So results. So first DV, first research question, chi-square analysis. We know that the results say that there was a significant difference in acceptance eligibility rate between African American women diagnosed with HIV and the rest of the population, but it's not where we thought it would be, right? So that means the ineligibility rates of African American women with HIV was 14% compared to 17% of the rest of the VR population. So we got this group of about 750 women, right, give or take a few numbers, and they're being accepted at, well, they're not being found ineligible at 14%, but the rest of the VR population is 17%. So we may say, oh, they're being discriminated against in application process, but that's not necessarily happening according to the large data. So that was one of those findings that was kind of surprising. So as Chan said, let the data tell a story, because when I got this first result, this is before we even did the regression, I was like, well, that's not the story I wanted to tell. Because I'm like, I'm a researcher, you know, that looks at disparities. I'm like, it has to be a disparity that's negative, because that's what I expect. And when it didn't happen that way, I was like, well, VR, we might be doing something good, you know, and that gives more efficacy to VR services. So that's good for the VR counselors out there. But maybe not necessarily good for me as a researcher who wants to say, tell a particular story. So then the second part is looking at the reasons for closure. And if we look at the reasons for closure, so that means that you're not getting denied, you're getting your application, but then when you're getting closed, you're not being closed as a 26. So it's no problem accepting you, but when you get accepted, you're not reaching the good employment outcome. So that's where there was a significant difference. That was what I would have expected. So that means that they had a lower closure rate. So African American women with HIV, 19.4% closure rate compared to 30.1% of the general VR population. So that's kind of what we expected. When we look at the data more specifically, it says that they had lower rates of service refusal. And I was like, that makes sense. That's my people. If you're going to offer them something, they're going to take it. But they had higher rates of refuse to cooperate. And I'm thinking, like, what is refuse to cooperate? So is that meaning you're not coming to your service meetings, you're not returning phone calls? That kind of refusal to cooperate, we don't know enough about what that category is, but that's higher rates. And then there have higher rates of unable to locate. So that's something that you would think, if you think about at the African American population, how you may have multiple movement because of poverty. You may have to move from apartment to apartment. You may not have a phone number. Your phone number may change. You may not have access to the internet to have email. So all of those things, like, you may not just be ignoring your counselor, but because of barriers that are systemic because of who you are as a racial ethnic person in America, these may be reasons why you're unable to locate. So we have to think about, like, the context of these results.
And that can also play with, well, I was just going to say that can also contribute to the refuse to cooperate. It may not be so much that the individual is refusing to cooperate, but if they're moving or dealing with other stressors in their life, financial, lower SES, that can impact that category as well.
I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out. Oh, sure.
Is refusal to cooperate operationally defined in some way, or is it more subjective in nature?
Oh, yeah. So that's a great question. And that's where I need to further, before we send this for publication, like really get into an investigation of what is refusal to cooperate. And so I need to further analyze the code book and to see if they just give you general recommendations of, unable to find, don't show up for appointments, which me working as an intern, that's the kind of things that are running in my head, because remembering, do you kind of remember, like, are those the things that they look at? Oh, come on. Yeah. He's another one who looks at the big data set. This is Joseph P.
Yes, during our internship at LRS, I remember when I did the phone calls, I had to document what was the outcome. They didn't respond, didn't answer, number change, and things like that.
Okay. Great, thank you guys. So the next results two that looks at our competitive employment status. So we have, after completing vocational rehab services, more than half, 61.8% of African American women clients diagnosed with HIV did not achieve competitive employment. So then we want to know, why is that going on? So these are some of the variables that are impacting competitive employment status. So one is the number of services provided. So we know that there's about 4 services provided for if you have competitive employment or if you have non-competitive employment outcome. It's about 4 services that they're averaging. Assessment, those services that we kind of looked at before. We looked at median cost of services, because using the median with the data that we had worked a little bit better than looking at the mean, because it was a little bit of a skew. So the median provided a better measure of central tendency. So we know that the median cost for competitive employment will be $2,829. And then for non-competitive employment, $1,624. And if you think about like services, like in the context, that's really, it may not be that big of a difference, because it could be cheaper services for certain vendors, that kind of stuff. So we have to put that in context of what's going on in the real world. Vocational guidance, that's probably not contracted out. Let me think. Job placement services may be more expensive for one vendor than another. So once again, always think about these results in context. And then the time in VR services, this is a pretty significant difference. So competitive employment, they're quicker. So they're going in and out. So about 2 years. 23.50 months. But non-competitive employment, they're staying in VR services longer, 33.12 months, but they're not achieving the employment outcome. And that kind of, if you think about it in context as well, it may make sense, because, if you have somebody that's moving you along, keeping you motivated, trying to get you in and out, that may be more encouraging than if you're slow in acceptance rate because you've been waitlisted, you're slow in getting your results from your extended evaluation, the IPE process was slow, or you may be in a training program and you may finish it, but then can't get a job. So, I'm just considering factors that may impact that time frame. But this is stuff we don't know. We just have to think as researchers how we can apply it. Okay, so we know that the most provided services, we eyeballed the data. So before we did any analysis, we were right? Assessment, vocational rehab counseling and guidance, and transportation services. So the predictors variables used in a regression model, we use age at application. We use 16 to 34 as the reference category, because that's kind of the beginning of your work history. So that's when you're getting like your first job. You may still be in college. So you're not necessarily like at that solid career phase in that kind of time frame. Maybe as you approach the 20s to 30s, but that's kind of our reference point. But if we expect 35 to 54, that's where you should be prime working age, and 55 to 64, also prime working age, we're ready for retirement. So that became the reference point. Educational level application, bachelor's degree became the reference point. Receipt of cash benefits, the reference point was no SSI or SSDI, and then the vocational rehabilitation services received. And there are 22 services that are provided. We took out the ones that were more interpreter services, personal care attendants. We took out those 4 services because it didn't make sense for our population. So we looked at the other 18. So step 1, we wanted to look at what are those variables that are significant to competitive employment status. So 1, receipt of cash benefits, that makes sense. And then 2 would be vocational rehab services. So that would be job placement, maintenance, diagnosis and treatment, occupational vocational training, on-the-job training, disability-related augmentative skills training, job search assistance, and on-the-job support. So what is that? About 8 of the 18 services were significant predictors of competitive employment status. And then if we go back to eyeballing the data, we kind of look at the percentages of those who were actually provided those services. But we know when they were provided it affected competitive employment. So then we wanted to look at those predictors of competitive employment in the presence of all other predictor variables. And so those that came out as more salient would be the receipt of cash benefits, and then job placement, maintenance, and diagnosis and treatment. So I kind of wanted to go back to let's really look at what maintenance is. So maintenance services mean monetary support provided for those expenses such as food, shelter, clothing that are in excess of normal expenses for the individual and that are necessitated by the individual's participation in assessment for determining eligibility and vocational rehabilitation needs or while receiving services under an IPE. So we talk about low SES, we talk about barriers, poverty. That makes sense that they would need these maintenance services, right? So then why, when we look at the eyeballing of the data, maintenance services shows up as about 21% for 16 to 34, 17% for prime working age, 93 persons, and then 8 persons, about 13.6% at the end of life. So we know that those maintenance services could probably be really, really beneficial for this population because of their unique circumstances, but look at who's receiving it. So this lets us look at odds ratio. So odds ratio, when you're doing logistic regression, it kind of lets you look at what is the odd of receiving competitive employment versus not receiving it. So you would say that the person who receives cash benefits is 0.58 times more likely and goes on 2.71 more likely, 1.70 more likely, and 0.65 more likely to achieve competitive employment compared to the other services provided. So these are our conclusions and implications.
Okay, so sorry about that. Okay. So the shift that we would like to move forward with is how is this applying to real life and daily application? And I don't know if that's working, I think so. Okay, so are we doing enough to educate and empower our community on the subject of HIV and AIDS? Have we become so complacent that we are okay with the alarming statistics that are working against our people? And are we ourselves part of the problem as we choose to ignore the real issues? So thinking about this shift in perspective and the implications of the data that we collected and the results that we found, one of the key components would be awareness and educating the community regarding HIV and AIDS awareness. And so hopefully as we shift towards evolving with social media, there's so much emphasis on connecting with others as far as social media and stigma, but exposure and just educating the community that individuals with HIV and AIDS can lead healthy quality of lives. Also, another quote that we have here is, just as those with various diseases are embraced and cared for by the community, we must extend that same courtesy to those infected with HIV and AIDS and end the judgmental ideologies and begin educating. So again, just re-emphasizing and reiterating the idea that we need to educate others, advocate for individuals with HIV and AIDS, and really just promote and foster the growth of a good quality of life regardless of HIV or AIDS.
I just wanted to say one thing.
Yeah. And this is where the videos would have came in. Yeah. So, because they really focus on this concept of awareness and education too.
Well, the reason we chose that photo, if you look at Hadea, if you remember in the 90s, she was the little girl on the Oprah Winfrey Show, talked about dying of AIDS. She contracted HIV through birth. And, you know, at that time, they thought you would die with AIDS. And look at her. Now she's a very, very powerful advocate. That's her, living healthy, beautiful, and is a strong advocate for Black women with HIV. And the next person, and I'll let her talk about, it was another key thing, Essence Magazine. This lady said, I'm dying of AIDS, 1994. That's her on the right, living in her 50s, lovely, still kicking. And she said, I just had to stay alive long enough for the medicine to catch up. So this is a shift in the perception. These people, even in the 90s, are living well today. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. And I apologize. I should have gave the story regarding Hidea. Yeah. Okay, so again, just looking at this perspective of, I'm going to read the quote to you. One day, my body reshaped itself without my permission, the fashion lover says. She saw her size 6 frame transform into a broad-shouldered size 14 on top and a size 4 in the waist. None of my clothes fit. I worked hard to reshape my body. She recalls. She also had fat buildup under her chin, and a dermatologist at her AIDS clinic performed liposuction. I still have a slight pouch, she says. It's a visible reminder I have HIV. New medicines arrived with new issues. Coletta gave Lewis Thornton kidney stones, and Sequenavir caused violent dreams. I held on, she remembers. Then I looked up and I was still alive. So again, as Dr. Johnson had mentioned, that she just had to wait for the medicine to kick in. And this was back in the 90s when she actually was diagnosed. And if you look at the magazine cover, I'm young, I'm educated, I'm drug-free, and I'm dying of AIDS. So back in 1990, when HIV awareness and AIDS awareness was first brought out into the community, and we had awareness about it, the stigma that was perceived was, I'm going to die. So what we've had this reshift in focus is now looking at this woman on the right where she's vibrant and healthy, and that people can live great quality of lives and they're not going, it's not a chronic illness. So yeah.
Well, it is a chronic
Well,
illness.
chronic illness, but manageable, and they can live good quality of lives.
Thank you. So the last kind of take-home message, I wanted to provide some resources for vocational rehab counselors, because some of the resources, like when we're in our training programs, we know about general aids that we can look at, the Department of Labor. We know JAN, where we can find information about accommodations. We learn about talking to employers, about a person with a disability. We try to enhance awareness, let them know that a person with HIV coming in, they can't get HIV by the general contact. Like, we do all of that education. But then there are more resources that are possibly necessary for voc rehab counselors to use in their engagement with employers. And there are some key people, Kenneth Hergengraber, Lisa Rosano, and really Liza Conyers, that have really been key stakeholders in like developing these HIV and employment resources that are actually knowledge translated. Basically, it's like toolkits that you can use. And so if you look at the first site, and I'm sorry if it's a little offset where you can't see it, but it comes from the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. So they have a full training program online that provides you training on how you can deal with these issues and interacting with employers and talking about HIV, a lot more than just stigma talk, but like practical implications of this is why you should have someone here. You can just know they value work, they want to be in the field, work and keeps them healthier. Yeah, that's the stuff we want to talk about, but businesses want to know about the bottom dollar. Like, are they going to be expensive with health insurance? Like, these are the things that they want to know. So you have to be able to talk from both sides, like the with the counselor or with the client needs, but also with the employer needs. That's all demand side. So module 1 talks about understanding the value of work. Module 2 talks about adopting an employment and training mindset organizationally and individually. And module 3 looks like incorporating employment into the HIV/AIDS service menu. And so you have to create a username and password. You go through the modules. They give you a little quiz to be sure that you have the knowledge content. So this is a free source that you can use. There are also some other sources that I have that I want to take a quick look at. So this is a list of kind of those major references on HIV/AIDS and employment. And the weird thing is, if you look at Liza Conyers, she's kind of one of those spearheaded persons looking at HIV and employment from Penn State. And she started talking about these in 2005, HIV/AIDS as an emergent disability, the response of vocational rehabilitation. But yet we're still here, 2016, like talking about the basic issues. When she published several articles in not only rehab-related journals, but public health-related journals. And she's the really one that has determined and would be the person that you cite to say employment is a social determinant of health for persons with HIV and AIDS. So her work has been awesome. What she's done, one of the things didn't show up, is established with several key partners an intervention as a part of the National Working Positive Coalition. And so this intervention provides services to African American women with HIV that want to become employed. And I had a slide, one second. Yeah, so the intervention is called the Client-Focused Considering Work Model. And it basically has 3 stages. Your pre-vocational, vocational development needs kind of assessment, but it's done in a culturally sensitive mindset. So it's done more like focus groups where the individuals, they develop a sisterhood where they can talk about the issues that are impacting them and becoming employed. And it's more of like a group counseling, sisterhood development, social support mind frame that deals with the kind of pre-contemplation, contemplation stage of the stages of change. And then they develop a micro enterprise circle. So that's dealing with the kind of actually doing the work-related behavior. So they have an intervention to decrease poverty, and that intervention is jewelry making. So they learn some of the jewelry making skills, they do it together, and they establish a little bit of a business. And from that business, they actually moved to stage 3, made it ourselves, and that's when they put the products in the actual marketplace. So if you went to NCRE conference, there was another intervention at home, looking at homelessness, where they did the same thing, kind of really using that community support that is a part of the African American culture and using that as a way to kind of amp up the intervention to make it culturally relevant. So I think that whole perspective that's client focused, that uses community and social support, family, that thing she kind of hit on really good for our community. And so I talked about some of her seminal articles, and I want to kind of hit at some of the vocational needs. So if you work for some of those HIV/AIDS programs, which is where I started my work, you are funded by some of these federal funding sources. So the case management program that I worked with was funded by the Ryan White program. Ryan White was one of those famous kids that had HIV and really was an advocate for HIV in the community. So they're naming the funding source from them. So when you're developing your service plans for them, it really comes from a medical case management model where you want to get them healthy, you want to get them integrated in care, you want to get them on their HIV meds, and you want to talk about risk reduction. But on the service plan, you have other things. You have increasing housing, employment, and all of those services, but what are you being paid for? Like the outcomes for those federal funding agencies are the medical-based outcomes. So they're not including those kind of employment-based outcomes in with the services that they're paying you to provide. So if you have the time or effort, you can do it, but it's not what you're being paid to do as a medical case manager. So at the time, about 3 months into my position, I'm like, I came from this master's rehab counseling program, this vocational rehabilitation counseling. I talked to my boss about, we have all of these people, they're in here, they come to my office, they look good, why are they not working? They have like SSI, SSDI, let's do something about it. And so she wrote a small pilot project with the Baton Rouge Area Foundation to provide benefits counseling to persons with HIV so they can figure out how they can work and still keep their benefits. So this is before we know all this training with Kate Anderson, like everything that they're doing, like she did it from the ground right there in Baton Rouge. And so they provided her some money, and they provided half of the funds for my position. So I switched to that role about 6 months in. And so I'm upset that when I got accepted into the PhD program, we were really in the process of getting that to work. So we know that, getting people in, talking to them about their SSI, their SSDI, their Medicaid, what they can do to keep those services while still getting employed. And most people were saying, okay, I'll do something part-time. So we're starting to work on those service plans. And then I got accepted into this program and out. So the good thing is they were able to get continued funding for that position. A benefit specialist still works at that service agency. And so even though the federal funding sources of Ryan White don't provide their vocational benefits counseling, she was able to get that service funded from a private organization. So this is an innovative way in which people can do it, And the other thing is having voc rehab counselors, I think, actually go to the agencies and set up shop. A lot of times persons with HIV are really closed off. They trust their case managers, they trust the case management agency, because they know that if they go in there and say, I'm a person with HIV, no one else outside that door is gonna know. So if you come to where they're at, that may be a beneficial thing to do, instead of expecting persons with HIV to come to your office and say, okay, I have HIV, help me find a job. Come to them where they are, meet with them in conjunction with their case manager so that you establish trust, and then after you establish trust, move on to providing those services. And I talked a little bit about comorbidities and multimorbidities. So we know that HIV may be the thing that's well controlled, but then you have to worry about all of those other things that we're disproportionate in. And obesity is a huge factor in African American women. And with obesity comes all of those conditions that you struggle with, diabetes, hypertension, which lead to things such as stroke. Consider the cost on the strain economy. Why people want state federal VR? Because they say it works. For every dollar I invest in you to help you get to work, you pay back this in taxes and federal. So it works from a business standpoint. Sometimes, as Dr. Wayman talked about earlier, when you're talking to businesses, when you're talking to congressmen, they want to know about the dollar. A lot of times it may sound good and it may seem like, oh, that's the value we should have. We should want to help these people. But at the end of the day, you have to look at the numbers. And so we know that the lifetime cost of HIV from diagnosis to death is about $379,668. But if we can say employment is a social determinant of health, and that means that people who are employed are going to take better care of themselves, stay healthier, then guess what? That can reduce that lifetime cost over time. So this is how you sell it to funding agencies, right? And total cost of those newly diagnosed, $16.6 billion. And then if we look at treating chronic health conditions as a whole, so all people living with chronic health conditions that are manageable but not really taking care of themselves, they say that 68% of all healthcare spending for the year 2010 was with people with manageable non-communicable type diseases. So we're spending 68% of our costs on those things, not cancer, not those terminal type diseases, but on manageable diseases. So this is how you sell it. When you're writing your grants, like these are the stats you want to bring in. You want to bring in that value base, but you also want to talk about that dollar. And hopefully that's how you get funded. People like Joseph Pete and Susan Flowers and all of those new wave of rehab counseling educator researchers who are doing great things. So on a closing note, Lisa Conyers, I talked about her, seminal in HIV and employment. She works with Kenneth Hergengrader, Lisa Rosano, establishing a National Working Positive Coalition. They had also an institute. Hopefully I didn't leave that slide off. But internationally, there was a coalition internationally where she serves. So she talks about HIV and employment, not just in the US, but HIV and employment internationally, works with those persons in the White House. So go to her literature and let's try to extend her work. Paul Wayman talked earlier about, okay, we know all of this. We've used big data. Now intervention is the way to go. And one of the things he said, you want to be a famous researcher, you come up with the RRTC and say, we have this disparity. We know it exists from all this data sets and stuff that we've been doing every time since RSA 911 data came out. Now develop a pilot study. Now say, okay, I know this population has this. Let me give them this work-related intervention, compare it to treatment as usual, and see what happens. That intervention research is the way to go. We know what works. Let's use it. So any other questions or comments or concerns? You look like you want to say something. you're ready for us to shut down.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.